Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to We're Fucked Until We're Not, a podcast talking about all things climate change for 15 minutes or less. Environmental education, to me, has been a little too kumbaya lately, and while I love optimism, I think that there's just been a little too much flowery talk lately, and we need to be more straight up about the problems and solutions when it comes to climate change. And that's exactly what we're here for. I'm your host, Mehul, and I'll be doing this every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Before we go ahead, feel free to give us a follow on any of our social media platforms. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. But if you aren't really that active on social media and still want to get involved, then definitely shoot us an email. I'll make sure to put all of the links in the description below. Now let's get into it. I took a poll a few weeks ago on social media to see what people thought the cheapest source of electricity was. Now, the number one answer for cheap electricity was conventional coal power, and the answer for what people thought was the most expensive was solar power. I was planning on making this episode soon, but after seeing all the social media interaction as well as everything going on in Texas, I thought that now was as good a time as ever to go into it a bit more. Now, you see solar power pretty much everywhere, like you'll see panels on really little things like portable chargers, but you also see them on really large things like homes or office buildings, or if you live in certain parts of the country or the world, you might have seen some solar farms as well. But other than seeing some panels here and there, a lot of people don't really know what goes into it, and because of that, there's a lot of myths surrounding solar power as well. I think one of the biggest myths is that fossil power is the dominant form of power out there because it's also the cheapest form of power out there. But that's actually not the case. It's not coal, it's not oil, it's not other alternatives like nuclear and wind, but it's solar. In fact, solar power is the cheapest source of power in history. In fact, solar is so cheap to produce right now that if 86% of coal plants were to be replaced by solar by 2025, it would save these countries millions of dollars going forward. It's actually cheaper to build and maintain a solar farm than it is to keep the traditional coal plant running. That usually begs the question of why solar isn't being used more if it's so cheap to produce and maintain. The answer really isn't that surprising, it's also money. In this case, it's lobbying money. You see, fossil fuel lobbying and political donations outweigh all other sources of renewable energy by a ratio of 13-1. That's because solar is so new and it's not as big of an industry yet as fossil fuels, so these fossil fuel companies have enough money to just pour money into political donations. Which means going forward, a lot of politicians kind of make favorable policy for them. And these companies have been struggling to compete for a while. In fact, solar wouldn't be as big as it was right now if it wasn't for a non-political agency like NASA. Fossil fuel companies wanted to slow the spread, but when NASA found out what solar could do and found that it was a way to power spacecraft going to really faraway planets, they thought that it was something that they needed to spread and would be really good for power grids around the world. And here's another myth about solar power, that it won't work in these larger countries because many of them have snowy areas which don't get enough sunlight for solar power. The thing is, solar panels do work in winter weather. Yeah, the output is definitely a bit lower than what it would be in the height of summer, but solar panels are actually more efficient in the winter because they also capture some of the sunlight that reflects off of the snow. And that's really important information for later. Now, in the past 30 years, since solar became more and more popular, the price for the production of solar energy went down 99%, and it's still going down, which is great for homes, offices, and schools trying to create a more grid-independent power system of their own. The thing is, though, with all the savings you get, being a single homeowner trying to go solar is incredibly tough, because it requires a sizable initial investment. So most people can't really afford to go solar despite the large return on investment unless they take out a loan, which most people rightfully don't want to do. But most of the emissions and energy savings associated with going solar won't even come from homeowners. What's more important is that large businesses and manufacturing companies and office buildings start going solar. Now, it's not even for the sake of the environment, but it's literally a way for them to save money, and they're the ones with enough money to make that initial investment. As for regular people like you and me, it's up to cities and states and countries to start making some public investment into solar power, knowing fully well that they'll make their money back. Instead of individual homeowners going solar, if public investment went into these solar farms and they added solar into their energy portfolios, these places would see their emission counts dropping and their constituents would save a lot more cash on electricity. It's literally a win-win. Now, this brings me to Texas, which I'll talk about in just a second. While we're on the topic of sponsorships, I just wanted to add that 20% of all proceeds from the podcast this month will be donated to the Indigenous Environmental Network. Back to Texas, though. For those of you that don't really know, Texas is currently in a huge humanitarian crisis to the point where President Biden declared it a disaster area. This past week, a major polar vortex sent winter storms and Arctic weather all the way down south to Texas, which is a state that usually doesn't see freezing temperatures. So obviously, the infrastructure in Texas wasn't prepared at all for something like this, and their power grid finally folded when these conditions set in and they saw a high demand for power like they've never seen before. For context, Texas is on its own independent power grid and not on the federal one because they wanted to evade some federal regulations and taxes associated with them. But because of this choice that they made, over 500,000 homes and businesses in Texas don't have power and still haven't gotten their power back as of Sunday, February 20th. Now on top of that, water pipes are bursting and people are dying from freezing to death, starvation, or they're dying of carbon monoxide poisoning as they turn on their cars in their garages to get some warmth. And officials really said that they have no idea when heat and electricity are coming back, and that's largely because of that lack of proper power infrastructure. The way their grid is set up, most of Texas's power comes from natural gas, which is pretty hard to get in the winter. Usually that's fine for them because their peak demand is in the summer, but this is a special case. Here's where it gets a bit more interesting though. 21% of Texas's power comes from renewable energy, and those smaller grids are faring much better. Even more interestingly enough is that a lot of Texas conservative officials are saying otherwise, even though all of the evidence supports renewable energy doing a lot better out there. Now, those same officials are saying there's not much to worry about going forward, and to them, they're saying it's a once-in-a-century event. But here's the thing about climate change. A lot of these so-called once-in-a-century events are becoming a lot more commonplace, and we've been seeing that already, and it's only going to get worse from here. So maybe incorporating some more of that very cheap solar power into Texas's energy portfolio can definitely prevent some of these problems going forward and save lives as well as money. And solar panels literally work in snowy areas, so this will mitigate some of these issues if this happens again. But this isn't really a local Texas problem. It actually shows why we need at least some solar power in all energy portfolios worldwide. Now, what I'm going to say specifically applies to the United States, but for my international listeners, chances are that this affects your country too, just give or take a decade depending on development. What's happening in Texas is almost universal. All power grids in our country are consistently given low ratings because of how they were built in the 1950s and 1960s, and they have a 50-year life expectancy. So now that we're in 2021, we're well past that life expectancy mark. In the United States, over 640,000 miles of high voltage lines run at full capacity almost 24/7, but they weren't really designed to do that. So that's putting a lot of strain on something that's already well past its life expectancy, which means that outages won't be localized like they were in Texas if things go south. If just 9 out of the 55,000 electrical substations in the United States went down, then the US government has admitted that we'd have a blackout lasting at least 18 months, which is something we aren't even close to being prepared for. And multiple studies and testifying professionals have shown that going this long without power means that about 90% of the American population would die. You'd think that something this dire would mean that electrical companies are actually doing something about preparing for it and improving their infrastructure, but because many of them are investor-owned, they don't want to cut into their profits right now to help make their infrastructure better because they want to appeal to their investors. And that's some logic I really question because, if only there were a cheaper form of power that these companies could start adding to their portfolios, which would save them money over time and prevent the collapse of American society as we know it. Because adding solar to part of their programs would literally make their grids more resilient, especially as more of these once-in-a-century events keep happening, which will put even more strain on these grids. Now, I'm not saying that we should go 100% solar. Solar power has its own issues. like the life cycle of the panels. In fact, some panels made a few decades ago were made to last only 20 to 25 years, so now that they're going bad, we're having a massive e-waste problem on our hands. Solar also doesn't give us a constant amount of power, so we can't put 100% of our resources into it. But as we start spending more money on solar power, the technology will only get better, giving these panels a larger lifespan and allowing them to become more recyclable without worrying about stuff like panel chemicals leaking into our water systems, or e-waste just collecting and we'll have no idea what to do with it. But at least going partially solar and transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards different renewable energy sources isn't just a matter of going green anymore. It's a matter of life and death, and if they won't think of that, it literally saves people money. Nobody stands to lose from this other than fossil fuel companies, and that's not really a bad thing either. They could very easily pivot to solar power if they wanted to. And that's all we've got for today. Let me know what you thought of the episode on social media. I've linked everything below, so if you want more resources or have some feedback for me, or if you fall in love with the sound of my voice, you'll know exactly where to reach me, and I'll see you guys next Wednesday.